Hi, folks. This is Tom Rodenhauser, and I lead the consulting, research, and advisory business for ALM Intelligence. I'll be the host and moderator for today's webinar. Really appreciate you taking time out from your afternoon to join us today. Today's webinar is part of a quarterly series we do on the state of the management consulting industry. Before we get started, though, I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping items. First, this session is being recorded. All of the attendees are on mute right now. We also get a lot of questions about the presentation itself. We do not distribute the deck, but because the webinar is being recorded, we do put a link, and we will send a link to you of the recording that's up on our website. That should be out in about 24 hours after the webinar. Now, you should all be able to see our presentation screen right now. At the top right of your screen is the GoToWebinar panel, where you can ask questions via chat. Feel free to ask questions throughout the program. We are going to carve out a little time at the end to answer as many questions as we can. Those we don't get to, we will certainly answer offline and get back to you then. So with the housekeeping out of the way, I would like to get on with the program. So our theme today is Management Consulting 2020, and it's a reflection of how we feel the industry is adapting or trying to adapt to a world that's become incredibly interconnected. What we've done today is we've gathered our group of analysts here at ALM to help explain how the market's evolving and to discuss the implications of that to both clients and consultants. So joining me are Lhasa Pitkanimi, Nathan Simon, Liz DeVito, Laura Becker, Matt Merker, Tomek Jankowski, and Naima Essing. They're at the front lines in terms of analyzing the market. And what they do, they spend their days really evaluating both the providers and the markets themselves. So what we're going to do today is get some of their insights in what they're hearing and what they're seeing and how it's affecting both the buyers and the providers. Now, many of you are familiar with our ALM Vanguard charts and our reports. We also conduct, the Vanguard reports are capability assessments of providers. They help inform buyers of services as to who's good, better, best in various service areas. We also conduct market sizing and growth forecasts by service areas, by client industries, and by geographic regions and countries. So for today's webinar, what we're going to do is present some viewpoints on the industry growth and what we see driving consulting services over the next few years. Now, before we get to that, I would like to offer a little bit of context and to try to look at the market, where it's been and where we think it's going to. So the question we're looking to answer here is how we got here. Now, this particular chart is a way to describe the old consulting value proposition. And if you think about it, and knowing that we cover the market, both the global providers all the way across to specialists and boutiques, what this depicts is really the traditional buying clusters, kind of the C-suite. And the idea that various types of consulting firms would sell their services into these buckets. Now, there's also a correlation to both the price and the value perception for various types of consulting services. And how that translates is into, what we would describe as, historically speaking, staying in your lane. So what you had was really kind of the classic strategy consultants trying to serve primarily the CEO and board level as their clients and talking specifically about reputation and business alignment. They also sold into and served the CFO from a financial standpoint and portfolio management, asset management, things like that. The more traditional process improvement folks, they would sell primarily into the COO, the operations side, and as technology has become pervasive, obviously selling through to the CIO. The HR and talent folks and the risk and technologists, again, primarily looking at the two buckets, the two C-suites that were actively involved in technology platforms and certainly on the people of risk and compliance side. And of course, the big four firms, multi-service firms, a term you've heard us use, they kind of sit in the middle and do a bit of everything for everybody. And the correlation, the perception that strategy was at the highest value and therefore the highest price, and technology was lower value, lower price, again, that's kind of a historical reflection. Over the last 10 years, it's changed pretty dramatically. And what's happened from our vantage point, knowing that we cover services as our primary area of emphasis, we've actually adopted and look at the market through what we call an integrated model. And this integrated model really aligns still with the corporate organization. So from a functional standpoint, we're really looking at the corporate office, the front office, the middle office, and the back office. This is consistent with any organization. And the actual services that are offered to those parts of the organization are around, if you think about it, the revenue side, so really strategy all the way over to operating model strategy. Those are elements that, again, the corporate office is most intense when they're going out to procure consulting services. And then when you work your way around, you actually start getting into the expense side of the organization where efficiency and costs come into play. So the reality, though, and this is a significant difference, I think, with how a lot of folks may look at the market, we believe that both digital and risk are embedded in everything that consultants do or should be doing. So the idea of carving out digital as a separate offering is really already, we think, passé. And instead, digital is really at the heart of pretty much everything that's going on in all these service areas. Likewise, risk, which historically has been defined as whether it's regulatory or compliance-oriented, risk itself is also inherent in every service. You're either mitigating risk or you're looking at the risk factors relative to the efficiency gains or the revenue gains. So there's always a balance there. What this integrated model means is that a service provider, a consulting service provider that might be doing enterprise strategy work has to be connected and has to be aware of what's going on the operations side. Everything's integrated from this standpoint. This is the way clients are looking at it increasingly. And what happens is a lot of firms will be focused in certain areas, and then other firms will be focused in adjacent areas, and the client has kind of been left to coordinate those, the effects of the services by one area and another area. The reality is, and this is where the multi-service firms come into play, every global firm is offering virtually every one of these service areas. And so the idea of being a one-stop shop has become pervasive in terms of what firms are able to offer. Now, further complicating and maybe defining the market is the idea that management consulting is at the core of a broader set of professional services, what we characterize as the periphery. For those of you who read our reports and maybe attended previous webinars or presentations, we talk a lot about the periphery because increasingly a lot of management consulting firms are offering these services and offering it in a more integrated way. The most obvious example when you think about one of the big four firms, for example, is they do have their consulting practice, they have their audit practice, they have their tax practice. Increasingly, they're being not packaged together, but the idea that they're more integrated and that they're able to offer clients holistic services. That's part of the attraction there. Likewise, you see in the front office areas the things that are happening in advertising and digital design. This is where digital has a lot of play. And as a result, you're seeing firms that are getting into kind of this aspect of it, but at the core, they're still a management consulting firm. Today, we really want to focus on this, the management consulting core. And what we want to do is present a little bit of where we're at from a size and growth standpoint. And what I'd like to do is introduce my colleague, Lasse Pitkanimi, who does all of our quantitative research. And Lasse was going to talk a little bit about the global market and kind of the geographic breakout, and then also talk a bit about what's driving that. So Lasse?
Thank you, Tom. So our research divides the consulting market into four major geographic areas. The Asia Pacific, EMEA, and Latin American markets have 5 subsegments each, whereas the North American market is divided into US and Canada. In terms of market share, the North America and EMEA market both command a share above 40%. The Asia Pacific market is slightly above 15%, and the Latin American market is by far the smallest, with a share significantly below 5%. As a company, we've issued the annual global report on the consulting market since 1995, and they've always provided a 40,000-foot view of the space. Some of the larger global trends we see today include recessionary/fiscal concerns, increased political instability, rewriting of trade rules, and increased consolidation among the top consulting providers. When it comes to the economy, we are now seeing a fair amount of leading indicators turning around and pointing towards a possible recession within the next 2 years. Of course, we can't predict the ultimate timer or the trigger for this, but the signs are there, in terms of things like tightening credit conditions, overextended valuations, problems in the global economic periphery, and in this case, I'm referring to countries such as Italy, Turkey, China, or most of Latin America. On the aggregate level, of course, the consulting market will not be and has not been immediately impacted by these changes due to the fact that project pipelines tend to reach 1 to 2 years into the future. So from an economic standpoint, you can call the consulting market a so-called lagging indicator. However, our network of experts has already witnessed companies shifting their consulting spend from the front to the back office. And this has multiple factors affecting this change aside from the economy alone. One of them is the increased political instability, which highlights uncertainty around ROI, making it preferable to focus on perfecting existing operations rather than introducing any sweeping changes. The end result is that our updated forecast now shows the front and back office growing at roughly similar rates, which is something we have not witnessed since the Great Recession. In terms of trade policy, we are now seeing a continuation of the backsourcing/nearssourcing trend that began primarily in North America about half a decade ago due to increased automation and development of tight oil sources through fracking. What those trends essentially made was that it allowed companies to locate the manufacturing closer to the end customer without having to pay large premiums for labor or for energy. The breakdown of the existing trade rules and an escalation towards a trade war have mostly just sped up the process. Unfortunately for companies, unlike the free market-driven tech changes, this dynamic is a lot more unpredictable, and hence companies are responding through reducing risk, which includes shortening or simplifying their supply chains by seeking alternative sources to key raw materials and components. So in other words, the goal of getting the cheapest price with acceptable quality, timing, etc. parameters is now shifting towards securing supply. Supply chain consultants have, of course, benefited from these developments, which, together with a tightening consumer credit, has translated to a spending shift from the front to the mid-office. And finally, provider consolidation keeps increasing year after year, driven by the trend or the need of being able to offer holistic consulting services across all four geos to the largest companies. And primarily, this consolidation has been centered around the M&A activity seen amongst the HR providers and through a series of almost never-ending small acquisitions by the big four auditing firms. It seems that the global revenues for consulting firms between roughly 250 million to about 1 billion remains the danger zone because these companies are too small to serve the larger global entities, but they are too large to live off the mid-market alone. So we expect to see more acquisitions or companies buying up these entities in the future. And back to you, Tom.
Thanks, Lasse. Appreciate that. You know, as Lasse indicated, it is a global market, and looking at it geographically, you can see the dominance of North America, EMEA, and at the same time, one of the things that we're looking at is different parts of the world and adapting to kind of traditional consulting services. So growth from a geographic standpoint is interesting. Certainly, Lasse spoke about specific client industries and how consulting is serving them. From our standpoint, we take a services first approach because that is we'll call it the common language amongst consultants. And every firm has practice areas and service and solution offerings. And what we've done, as you saw in our integrated model, is we've normalized them along 9 specific service categories. And what I'd like to do now is talk about where we're going. And the drivers in terms of kind of the past few recent years and the next few years, there's a shift going on. And what I'd like to do is bring in my colleague, Nathan Simon, to talk about this. Nathan is the philosophical leader of our research team in terms of setting direction and methodologies and things like that. And he'd like to talk about really the growth correlations. So, Nathan?
Thanks, Tom. So we're going to go around our wheel of 9 services and dig in a bit on each one. But before we do that, I want to take another look at the overall service picture. And I want to try to bring a little more precision to the point around an integrated service model. The slide in front of you shows 2 tables. The one on the left relates to the 2013 to 2017 period, so it's a look-back table. And the one on the right is our look-forward table, looking at the period from 2017 to 2021. And each of these tables is basically looking at the correlations between each of our 9 service areas. So if we look at the pairwise growth correlations over these periods, we're looking at 36 different combinations. And each of these tables shows the top 5 correlations on the left side and the bottom 5 on the right. And I think there's an interesting story we can see here. If we start on the left side, looking at the 2013 to 2017 period, the first thing that stands out is really the legacy consulting model, sort of the remnants of the legacy that Tom was talking about with the stay in your lane market structure. So we still see a close correlation between strategy and corporate finance, and that is something we've seen for many years, the linkage between M&A consulting and strategy consulting. The other thing we see on the right column of the left-hand table is that supply chain is typically uncorrelated with almost everything else. And that's also a feature we've seen for many years, where supply chain operations really sort of march to its own drummer, so to speak. But what was new in the 2013 to 2017 period was really the rise of the CMO buyer. And so if you look at the closely correlated markets, we see linkages between the front office and the back office. So between R&D and operations, R&D and rewards, customer topics, marketing and sales topics and rewards, and customer and operations. And this was really looking at this was really the linkage of services. Of course, recall, 2013 to 2017, this was sort of the height of the sort of slow growth margin pressure period. And so a lot of companies were looking to really pull resources out of their back offices and reallocate them to the front office. And the focus was very much on how to really power that transition using digital technologies, both to take cost out of the back office and then reallocate towards the front office. If we look at instead to the right at what's coming, so we've got 1 year of sort of full data and a good part of another year, plus our forward look, we're seeing an interesting shift, or we're expecting an interesting shift. I think what's going on here in our view is that in many cases the front office strategies are relatively well established now on the client side, and at the same time, harking back to what my colleague Las was talking about, there's some concern about the future economic outlook. And the focus in the consulting integration is really on bringing supply chain services together with back office operations and talent and reward services. So this is interesting because in the past, supply chain was always off on its own. Now we're seeing supply chain services sold much more in tandem with back office services. And what we think is going on here is really that as companies have put that front office strategy in place, they're now looking to really move, especially what are ultimately more sort of digital, customer-centric oriented strategies, move those into the core of their businesses, which means they really need to now re-instrument their supply chains and link them up with their back office operations. The outlier now, if we look on the right side of this table, is the operating model topic, which includes organization and corporate services. Those services we see really being sold more standalone now, but part of that is also that we're seeing a good portion of those services being integrated into sort of almost everything that consultants are doing. Now I'll stop on this here, and I'm now going to start to, we're going to go around the wheel and dig into each of the service areas. So we're going to start by looking at the corporate office services, which for us includes 3 different service areas. One is enterprise strategy, corporate finance, and then operating model. These are ultimately the services, as my colleague Tom was saying, that are procured by the corporate office and are typically associated with asks that are directed at really setting the overall sort of agenda and direction for the client organization. I'm going to start by discussing the enterprise strategy area, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues. Within enterprise strategy, we look at 2 groups of topics. One is more classic strategy topics, and then we also look at risk topics. I'm going to ask my colleague Laura to discuss the risk side. But first, on the enterprise strategy side, we do a deep dive here on 2 topics. One is strategic planning, which lines up most closely with the client's P&L. And then we look at portfolio and capital strategy, which aligns more traditionally to the capital budgeting process. On the business strategy and planning topic, the big change here, and by the way, we see both of these growing more strongly. And overall, I should just set the context here. The graphic you're looking at, the left side stacked bar shows the share of these services in the overall spend, consulting spend in 2017. And the right side stacked bars shows the share of growth. So if the equivalent colored bar on the right side is bigger than the one on the left side, that tells you that market is gaining share in the overall consulting market. And spending on these strategy topics is up overall, or we forecast to be up overall. On the business strategy and planning, getting back to that, the big shift here has really been a move towards clients asking more directly around the planning process itself. Historically, that wasn't a strong feature of the client ask, something that consultants often tried to sort of deliver through the back door. But now we see it much more front and center as companies are really trying to restructure how they do strategic planning with much more focus on kind of an always-on process. We also see much more focus on the role of the CSO, corporate development, and the strategy talent in the organization. That also was historically not a feature of this market. On the portfolio and capital strategy, this is one of our most volatile. In fact, it is the most volatile segment in terms of growth that we look at. There was a big jump in spending in 2017 that was really about anticipated tax code changes here in the U.S. and the global repercussions of that. More broadly, we see here a focus on the client side of moving away from sort of a traditional industry-centric view of assets towards less tangible corporate assets as companies are trying to sort of organize their strategies more around things like customer experience, lifetime customer value. This has really changed the nature of corporate assets. So consultancy is trying to kind of rejigger how they think about portfolios, and also a much stronger focus on the actual transformation of the portfolio. Historically, the only real link there was to the M&A space. Now we're seeing much more internal asset reallocation, and consultants trying to help their clients, move assets from less value-adding to more value-adding applications. Now I'm going to ask my colleague Laura to speak to the risk side of this market.
Thanks so much, Nathan. So within enterprise strategy, cybersecurity consulting is really seen as a very significant growth driver. And obviously, this is backed by its role in risk management. As digital transformation continues to create strong demand, new technologies throughout the value chain, including customer-facing apps, create new threats every day. And data, as Nathan just alluded to, is rapidly becoming an organization's most valuable asset. So organizations need to really try to protect their consumers' data privacy. So the need for security is essential, with risk management as the overarching backbone. Having recently completed research on cybersecurity consulting capabilities, it's very clear to me that consulting firms are adapting to the changing needs of their clients. And what I've heard a lot is there's no way to eliminate all risks, but with proactive steps, the idea is to minimize them to the extent possible. And more frequently, consultants and their clients recognize that they need to take a business-driven approach to this technical problem. So consulting firms are shaping their capability offerings to meet new client demands in several ways, which I'll go over briefly. First, there is a significant brand and reputational risk to clients from a potential cybersecurity breach, as we all know. And consulting firms are brought in by boards in the C-suite as trusted advisors to guide and monitor the security process, and are asked to provide end-to-end execution from business-driven strategy all the way down to products, tools, and services, which is something that we haven't seen before. Because the board really wants peace of mind from an authoritative source. It's almost like a rubber stamp. Second, the need to adapt to the digital revolution and increasing threats has not gone unnoticed by regulatory bodies. So compliance is still a very big driver of initial consulting demand. Consultants are seeing significant demand from GDPR and other regulations such as the China Cybersecurity Law, HIPAA, and now we have the California Consumer Privacy Act of 2018 to protect consumers' data, which is going to be some significant legislation. We'll see if other states follow suit. Consultants are working with organizations to meet compliance requirements at a bare minimum, but also explaining the need to go beyond that as well, because the compliance alone is not going to be enough. There needs to be proactive measures taken. Third, there's a very significant shortage of cybersecurity talent, and even consulting firms are having difficulty finding the right skill sets. So a lot of consulting firms are aligning themselves with universities. They're recruiting and training next generation workforce talent, along with measures such as training veterans and young recruits. Often clients can't even staff these initiatives on their own, so consultants are providing new services such as staff augmentation on site and virtually. Fourth and lastly, and very importantly, managed security services have become a significant area of growth for many consulting firms, as clients from the largest to the smallest are finding they lack resources internally. So consulting providers are now offering cybersecurity centers globally, innovation labs, data scientists, shared threat intelligence, and advanced detection. And clients have options, including on-premise services with consultant oversight, co-sourcing, or outsourcing. So due to the change in global dynamics with digital transformation, the need for risk management, cybersecurity, and data privacy consulting will really continue to drive spending in the enterprise strategy space. And now I will pass it along to Tomek, who is going to speak about corporate finance within the enterprise strategy space.
Thank you for that, Laura. Taking a look at corporate finance, we break it into two basic categories: transaction advisory services and balance sheet strategy. Beginning with transaction advisory services, as Nathan alluded to earlier, client expectations are definitely shifting in this space. So transaction advisory has become, over the past decade, a key part of client growth strategies, and not just on the acquisition side. Companies have become much more adroit at incorporating joint ventures, alliances, and sell-side deals into their longer-term strategies, and consulting firms have played an important role in that. That, in turn, has prompted a transformation in consulting firms themselves in how they approach transaction advisory. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But just stepping back for a moment, there is some unevenness quarter by quarter, but on the whole, deal volume in transaction advisory remains strong in 2018. And consulting provider pipelines are full. But counter to that, like moths to a flame, consulting firms have been gravitating towards the transaction advisory market in droves. Particularly over the last 5 years, there's been a huge amount of investment in transaction advisory practices, and that has made this one of the most crowded and competitive consulting markets across the board. And transaction advisory has become, for many consulting firms, a major contributor to their bottom line. This has spread to the large-scale proliferation of boutiques specializing in transaction advisory, or some aspect of it: valuation, due diligence, disputes and litigation. This has been facilitated by the clients on the whole becoming more sophisticated in their approach to transaction advisory, with some developing in-house M&A teams, and they have been increasingly able and willing to manage multiple consulting firms on a transaction advisory project, to the great frustration of some providers. But despite this, there's been this odd countervailing trend whereby some clients have been pressuring consulting providers, both the largest and middle tier ones, to develop fuller end-to-end capabilities across the transaction advisory process. But clients aren't necessarily looking for a single provider to manage the entire process. What they want is what I call the supermarket model. They want to be able to pull in a la carte consulting firms' expertise or capabilities anywhere in the process as needed, but they're still willing to manage multiple providers or multiple vendors throughout the process. Another challenge for the consulting providers in transaction advisory is that with the rise of joint ventures and sell-side deals, combined with the advent of alternative finance, deals have become much more complex. On the one hand, underscoring the need for consulting providers in this space, but also putting pressure on them to have all of the necessary skills, including the talent across process, risk, compliance, technology, human capital, geography, and industry in-house. Exacerbating this is the increasing need for complicated technology, as Tom was talking about earlier. Data and analytics, RPA, AI, machine learning, AR, VR, drones, etc. This is all leading to a creeping assetization across consulting services in general, but much more so in transaction advisory. And what this is doing, ultimately, all of this is adding up to great pressure on fees. So while this is a very lucrative and important space, increasingly for providers, the challenge is to be able to provide what clients want affordably and profitably. Leading into this and taking a look for a moment at balance sheet strategy, which we define as capital structure management and strategy. This has become, in some ways, it was originally a topic unto itself. It was a specialist area for some consulting providers, but it has become increasingly tied to transaction advisory services. And in fact, a lot of providers approach balance sheet strategy with their transaction advisory practices. These services are being exacerbated by the speed of capital, the enhancements and how risk is being measured, shifts in finance, innovations in business models that Tom was talking about. All of these are contributing to greater attention to balance sheet strategy, but again, the narrower issue isn't simply looking at narrow strategy. It's how to integrate transaction advisory, how to integrate capital structure into broader organizational needs. So with that, I want to hand things over to my colleague Liz DeVito for talking about the operating model.
Okay, thanks, Tomek. And last but not least is operating model, which we define as consulting around the operating model and organization design of an organization, of a company, and also as that applies to the functions that support the company's internal customers, including those in the corporate center, shared services, outsourcing consulting goes around here, and the services provided by separate functional organizations. So as you can see from the illustration up here on the screen, it's the green bar stack there in this bar, and it is the slowest growing of these three, but it is growing nonetheless. Just a little bit slower than the other two domains and North America overall. But we are still forecasting continuous positive growth over the forecast period. And what those drivers of growth are, there's a lot, but I'm going to focus on three. A lot of it is, well, first of all, there's the knock-on effect of the growth in corporate finance and enterprise strategy. Because let's face it, when you have a strategy, you change a business model or a strategy, the organization design has to change. And so one leads to the other. But in terms of what clients are looking for, a lot of that demand is around the pursuit of agility, the agile organization. And this is because companies are facing an imperative to be able to adapt their organization design to more frequent cycles of strategic planning, but also to manage the end-to-end processes that support the customer experience from the front through to the back office. So that's a big driver. The other thing, in terms of corporate finance, Tomek was just talking about transactions. That's a huge driver of demand for operating model consulting. But the other thing is that corporate finance is increasingly responsible for, optimizing the business support functions, HR, IT, finance, procurement, all of those functions that serve the internal customers of the organization. And, it's interesting because this morning I was on the phone with EY talking about this very subject, and they were telling me about an innovation center that they set up in Germany that is specifically for CFOs, and it is specifically for innovating around global business services. So there's a big commitment, a big play going on here. But I think in terms of what's driving growth in corporate, in operating model strategy is that you just can't ignore the impact of technology. It is a huge driver. A lot of innovation around emerging technology adoption are robotics, natural language processing, all of that. A lot of that innovation is happening in the back office. And so, what the big shift that's going on in the marketplace is that clients realize digital transformation is not enough. What they really need is continuous service delivery. So if you think of it, now this isn't to say digital transformation consulting is not important, but if you look at it like a car, digital transformation is the engine and continuous service delivery is the GPS. And so this is another thing that is driving growth in operating model consulting. So who's growing? It's mainly those global multi-services firms that have the ability to bring this breadth of capabilities in strategy, operations, technology, digital, and the peripheral services too, regulatory, tax, those things. These are all being brought into the redesign of business models and operating models. So now that was a very high-level overview, and I think we're ready to move on. That does it for the corporate office buyer. And now I'm going to hand it over to Nathan, who's going to move on to the next segment.
Okay. On the front office side, we look at both R&D topics, product development and innovation, as well as customer marketing and sales topics. On the R&D side, innovation strategy has really been a strong growth area for the last 3 years, 2016 through 2018. But we actually see that coming down a bit as clients are really focused on getting something into the marketplace, which is pushing some spending towards product development operations, but also into some other areas, more in the back, into the supply chain and back office as well. On the product development side, the focus here is very much on sort of moving from a lean engineering towards more team analytics, trying to bring in process automation where possible, agile techniques all overall. And the big push in the product development side as well is really around helping clients who are moving from a sort of product-centric product development organization towards a products and services and or a products embedded with software, which is pushing a lot of attention to systems engineering organizations and the whole PLM, PDM infrastructure that needs to get updated. On the customer side, pricing has really been the standout. Pricing has been going very strongly for a number of years, initially as a way to deal with slow growth economy, but increasingly pricing is part of a trend that's really driving the whole customer space, which is the integration of pricing with marketing and sales and branding and service in many instances around a personalized experience for the customer, and this is having an impact on the provider side, because the marketing and sales customer space historically was a real cottage industry of providers. We've seen a lot of consolidation as firms are trying to need to really be able to offer that integrated service offering in this space. Tom, back to you.
Thanks, Nathan. We're actually going to move into the middle office now, which is primarily supply chain. And what I'd like to do is have my colleague Naima Essing speak to this. So, Naima?
Great. Thanks, Tom. Supply chain consulting is actually in fashion again, and it is currently experiencing pretty high demand, which we do expect to continue, but slow relative to some other areas. But the current high demand is really due to a couple of big trends. The first is really just the positive economy coupled with the rise of e-commerce, which is driving greater volumes and complexity in the supply chain, and that's due to SKU and distribution channel proliferation. In the meantime, we're seeing higher shipping rates and wages. We just saw the minimum wage for many warehouses go up to $15 an hour, for example. And these higher rates and wages are arising from shortages in labor, warehouse, and trucking capacity. And together, these are really driving up supply chain costs dramatically for companies. So the effect of these trends is it's increasing cost of goods sold, and it's really depressing company margins. The negative financial impact of this is elevating supply chain issues up to the executive level, which is a big change because in the past, the project sponsor in supply chain tended to be a middle office or functional head. As a result, we are seeing a lot more attention paid to the supply chain, and many say that they have seen more change over the last couple years than they have over the last couple decades. And essentially, while there's still ample opportunity for consultants to help their clients squeeze essentially more juice from the lemon through the application of lean methods, the greater opportunity today is, in order to achieve that next step change of improvement is coming from digital and automation, particularly among those more mature companies that have already experienced most of the gain that they can from applying lean methods. But this process of digitization, what it's doing, it's actually blurring the distinctions among the supply chain functions, as this greater connectivity and visibility across the supply chain expands optimization opportunities, not just within a function, but really in and among the different functions. And by allowing this more end-to-end holistic perspective, consultants can now go to wherever the problem lies. So, for example, a lot of firms are experiencing warehouse space shortages, and the result or the solution might be actually to improve supply chain planning, because with better forecasts, and more importantly, those forecasts are then shared with logistics, they won't need to have as large inventory, safety inventory stocks, and with smaller inventories, it frees up space and then increases capacity. So again, they can go to consultants can go to wherever the problems actually lie. So the impact of this on the supply chain consultants themselves is that firms really need to expand and deepen their functional capabilities. For example, more narrowly focused and specialized boutiques are increasingly being pressured to combine or partner with other firms to meet clients' that end-to-end need. On the other hand, we see the large full-service firms who already offer that end-to-end service perspective. They are actually acquiring or hiring specialized technical or engineering capabilities to solve specific problems within the supply chain. So, for example, in maintenance or in warehouse automation. But regardless of firm side, the pressure to strengthen their digital and systems technology capabilities to help their clients, everyone has to strengthen these digital and system technology capabilities. And the pressure is, or the opportunity here is more now on helping clients not only select, but even develop and integrate these new application and tools into their legacy systems in order to improve productivity. And with that, I will turn it over back to Tomek, actually, for capital projects.
Thanks, Naima. I appreciate that. So we're going to take a look at capital projects quickly, just a few points to hit. The traditional service delivery approach for consulting providers to capital projects has been industry-led, as Nathan talked about earlier, usually through their construction, infrastructure, transportation, or public sector industry practices. This is still largely true for many firms, but some market leaders have been moving a bit upstream to develop and bolster their offering around design and planning in capital projects. Again, another theme that Nathan had picked up. Traditional construction engineering companies have the technical capabilities around the construction process, but are much less able to holistically address IT, human capital, risk, and other key issues. Consulting providers are injecting strategy, risk management, and a quantitative economic impact dimension into project planning in a bid to avoid the pitfalls and unexpected outcomes that really bedevil capital projects at the moment. Some of the more successful consulting providers in the capital project space are involving their transaction advisory teams as well to help with complex project management, with finance, enhanced risk management, and particularly managing vendor and contractors. This has been one of the issues that again, have bedeviled the space. Another issue that Naima talked about, digitalization, is also an issue. Construction companies are infamously behind or lag with their use of technology. Many of them are still using the same processes and methodologies that these companies have been using for a century. Consulting providers today are often finding themselves running parallel digital transformation projects in capital projects, and with all the attendant operational, human capital, risk, and et cetera implications. So that's an important dimension that consulting providers bring. And finally, one final dimension is the issue of regulators. Government regulators are starting to become a bit nervous as a lot of investments are flowing into capital projects, both in the private sector and in the public sector. The failure earlier this year of Carillion PLC, very dramatically in the UK, has raised red flags everywhere, and so that's an issue where providers, consulting providers, are starting to look as well. With that, I want to turn things over to my colleague Matt Merker to talk about procurement.
Thanks, Tomek. And so now we transition to the back office functions, starting with operations, which include the foundational capabilities necessary for clients to execute strategies. And I'll start us off with a quick discussion on procurement operations before handing it off to my colleagues. So within procurement, clients continue to break down traditional silos that existed within the function, thus reducing redundancy and driving cost savings. They also continue to elevate the role of the chief procurement officer in the C-suite, which is placing increased onus on the people in these roles to drive cost savings beyond the simple operating model improvement. So CPOs are challenged in this area to continue to find new innovations for procurement functions. This is true within sourcing strategy as well, as clients need to think of new ways to interact with outside suppliers and be smarter in category management. So digitalization, while an obvious direction to take for increased optimization and transparency, is also coming with the onus of too much choice in some instances. The exponential increase of digital tools often leads to an issue of too many tools to choose from. Also, the poor implementation of digital in the past has led to this feeling of digital reticence in some C-suite situations. So a strong business case is also needed to come from the CPO in order to get stakeholder buy-in from the rest of the C-suite for any sort of digital improvisation. So all that said, consultants have several areas where they're having the most impact for clients in this space. Firms that are able to quickly assess current client capability are able to provide recommendations on the right digital tools to implement, kind of demystifying that selection process and also developing that strong business case that's going to get the necessary stakeholder buy-in. Firms with a finger on the pulse of the supplier markets are also able to guide clients through smarter, more agile decision-making and selection of key suppliers, utilizing those suppliers to drive innovation through synergistic interaction, through product development and improved relationship management, while at the same time mitigating risk from external factors such as the upcoming potential threat of potential tariffs. So sourcing and procurement is becoming increasingly dynamic, and consultants that are able to bring agility to their clients, whether that's through digital, through improved supplier relationship management, and also improved category management, are going to be the most valued. And that knowledge of geographic and industry-specific service areas and supplier bases is really going to be key in that factor, particularly for global clients. So that said, I'm going to hand it off to Laura for IT operations.
Thanks, Matt. So my theme of the day, again, is digital transformation, which is affecting demand for IT operations consulting as well. IT operations consulting will continue to grow with global megatrends creating strong client demand in several areas. First, digital transformation is an integral part now of every company. Second, legacy systems are really on their way out, and emerging technologies are taking over as innovation drives change. The role of the cloud is becoming increasingly important. And third, as mentioned before, data is turning into a very valuable asset for organizations, developing into a key element of competitive advantage. So these megatrends are driving changes for IT ops in general. And IT operations consulting traditionally had focused on the IT function with the CIO as the main buying center. But with digital embedded into every aspect of the enterprise, the IT function and the historical role of the CIO is undergoing rapid transformation. Consulting firms are leading the charge with capabilities to adapt to this digital environment and transform the IT function itself. In some cases, with some of the smaller to medium-sized companies beginning with a bimodal approach that involves maintaining legacy IT systems while incorporating more innovative technologies into customer-facing applications. But many of the most forward-thinking consulting providers and clients are now seeing that to really gain competitive advantage through digital transformation, there is a need for increasing collaboration between business leaders and the IT function. And forward-thinking organizations need to look at IT priorities as part of a business-driven strategy. New technologies are being embraced across the enterprise, aligning business and IT priorities in an integrated approach, with technology converging across business functions. This innovation requires careful collaboration, change management, and talent skills that need to be addressed through workforce and change management initiatives, in addition to dealing with the technology itself. So gone are the days of the CIO just being responsible for the IT function as a standalone entity. The CIO role is changing to more of a digital business enabler, and the role includes everything from building the right platforms for data, collaborating with the right people, working closely with C-suite level executives and business unit leaders throughout the organization to align business and technology goals. It will require significant effort from IT departments to implement the technology needed to keep up with these trends. The IT function, or as BCG likes to remind me, they call it the next-gen IT function, must move from the old-school IT infrastructure of having data scattered across various legacy systems toward digital platforms that use the cloud, enable advanced analytics, and support multi-channel platforms. Consulting providers will continue to help transform their clients' technology operations and will likely continue to see an increasing uptick in this space. And now I'll pass it to Tomek for finance operations.
Thanks. So just quickly, a few key points about finance. A major theme in finance is simply that finance is no longer the castle on a hill, complete with battlements and a moat ringed off from the rest of the organization. This is reflected in how we're talking about finance here today in the context of the larger operations category. Finance departments are being asked to integrate their services with other departments and align more closely with broader organizational strategy and to support the organization better through financing, through providing training around financing options for other departments, as well as risk and budgeting. So in general, finance is being asked to be more transparent and to integrate better and more closely with other departments in the company or in the organization. One of the biggest constraints for finance departments today is capacity. Finance departments are notoriously underfunded, tend to be resource starved, both in terms of technology and in terms of skilled people. So this is a major challenge where many consulting providers are developing augmented staff or managed services type of offerings to help finance departments both get through projects and beyond. And then finally, as Laura mentioned, there's a big story, but she really fleshed out the meat of it in a great way. The growing role of technology is in finance is really redefining how organizations think about finance and what the role of finance is in helping them achieve their strategies. So with that, I want to turn things over to my colleague Matt again to speak about rewards management.
Thanks, Tomek. And within rewards management, we view three key drivers within health benefits, retirement benefits, and compensation. So I'll be touching on those briefly. So a trend that we are seeing in the market is an increased focus on the employee experience. You often hear about the customer experience all the time and the importance of that, but it's the employee experience that is providing that internal capability and motivation for a strong external capability. To that end, rewards management is growing in importance for clients who seek to foster a strong work culture that is reflected in their outward business. Within the retirement benefit space, the onus of retirement readiness continues to shift from employer to employee and the shift from defined benefit to defined contribution. But employers are continuing to be increasingly concerned with ensuring that their staff are properly educated and equipped with the right tools to have a strong retirement plan in place. The paternalistic nature of benefits is not dying as responsibility transitions to the employee. It is simply mutating in response to that shift in responsibility. So evidence of that shift can be found in the increasing focus on financial wellness. Often considered just a piece of the overall wellness service offerings provided to employees, financial wellness is beginning to stand on its own as a key differentiator in benefits offerings. Services such as self-monitoring digital tools as well as ready-to-access financial advisors are becoming commonplace and expected in many instances now among workforces, particularly in the US and Europe, and particularly among the younger workforce. The health benefits landscape continues to evolve as well, as private exchanges continue to be used and wellness continues its transformation to holistic well-being. No longer focused on just physical health, clients are now offering programs that also target mental health, social health, and as I mentioned before, financial health. So part of rewards management advisory is also focused on the changing nature of compensation. It's no longer just a matter of providing the higher salary, though that is, of course, still of high importance. Compensation now goes further in this need to provide recognition for performance and other forms of perks beyond just salary to attract and retain talent, such as improved flexibility in workplaces, work from home, that sort of thing. So for consultancies, shifts create quite a bit of opportunity. Consultants are being used by clients to have better understanding of their workforce demographics, improved communication strategy capabilities, improved selection in private exchanges, and also just understanding that transition to holistic well-being. And that said, I'll hand it over to Liz for talent and leadership.
Okay, thanks, Matt. And I'm going to just make a couple of points about this market. I think the main thing that I want to say is that with the talent consulting market, it has historically been tied to economic cycles where organizations would spend in good times when they had money, the wallet would open. In bad recessionary times, they don't spend on it. This is changing, and this is a very recent development, I would say within the last 6 months to a year, because organizations know, number one, they have to be able to shape a workforce for the future. It needs to be an organizational capability. They have to be able to develop and reskill talent. So there's a lot of reasons for it. The other thing that I want to point out about this market is that it is still fragmented, where you have downstream services like leadership development, learning. You've got a lot of boutiques out there. You've got a lot of large domestics out there serving that market. But because it's fragmented, clients, they don't want to manage that anymore. They want their consulting provider to manage that ecosystem for them. And so another trend that I've seen in the last year is that companies are consolidating their talent consulting spend with one or two global providers and letting them manage the ecosystem. So I'm just going to leave it at that and hand it back to Tom to wrap things up.
All right. Well, thanks, Liz, and thanks, everybody. Good insights there. Appreciate it. I know we have taken our allotted time. Some questions that did come in, we will try to get to offline. We do encourage you, if you do have any questions, we have our contact point here, and we encourage you to send those questions. We're happy to discuss with you. And we do appreciate the time you spent with us today. So please enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we will see you at our next webinar. Thanks, everybody.